Space Marine 2 is pretty great, right? But did you notice this? All the armour on the characters have a ton of cool battle damage. The official paint schemes from the Heavy Metal team at Games Workshop, they're awesome, but they don't really tend to lean heavily into this weathering and battle damage look that you can see in the game. The reason for this is that the Heavy Metal style is great for showing off every detail on the model for marketing purposes, but what if you do want to lean into that heavy battle damage look? Well, I've got some tips for you. Our battle damage journey is going to start before we even put any paint on the model. Here I've got one of the Infernus Marines with a Pyre Blaster, and I'm going to take a drill bit and a hobby knife and start making scratches and gouges and dents in the armour. It's really fun to experiment and see what effects you can come up with. You can always refer back to screenshots from the game for inspiration. While I'm chipping away at this Space Marine, literally, let me know in the comments if you've been enjoying Space Marine 2 and what your favourite class is. Once we're happy with the physical damage, it's time to paint. I'm going to be painting up the Space Marine in an Ultramarine scheme, but you can paint yours up in whatever scheme you like, and then refer back later in the video for how to paint the weathering if you want to. So for my Ultramarine scheme, I'm going to start off with black primer, and once that's dried, I'm going to do a zenithal with the airbrush using Thamar flat white, which means spraying from above the model downwards. I try to keep a lot of the contrast by pushing the white on the highlights but avoiding the shadows as much as possible. If you don't have an airbrush, you can use a rattle can to create a zenithal highlight, but it just won't be as controlled. Once that is dried, I use Talisar Blue through the airbrush to filter over all of the model. The values, which is a fancy way of saying the shadows and highlights that we created with the zenithal highlights, will show through the semi-transparent contrast paint and give us some nice blue shadows and highlights. Again, if you don't have an airbrush, you can apply the contrast paint with a regular brush, but the highlights and shadows might not be so pronounced. So that's our blue out of the way, and now I'm going to be using the new P3 paints. I'm just going to quickly run through the paints used here and where I'm using them. These paints are really nice, as you'd expect from a brand with heritage like P3. Steamforged Games have done a great job of keeping that heritage alive. For the gold, I'm using solid gold. This needed about 2 coats to get solid coverage, and I used this on the shoulder trim and the Aquila and a few other details. For any silver metals, I'm using cold steel. This was really nice metallic. For the gun casing and undersuit, I start with Thamar black and then highlighted it with Immortal black. For the Pyre Blaster muzzle, I'm using Deathless metal. And any leather I painted using Rhok hide. For the parchment of the Purity seal, I used Rin Flesh. And for the seal itself, I used Murderous Magenta. What do you think of these paints? Will you be picking any up? With those all done, we have everything coloured in where we need it, and it's time to add some transfers. First thing, I apply some gloss varnish by a brush. I'm not really sure that's needed with how much we wrecked the shoulder pads, but it's good practice. Then we're going to soak our transfers in some water. While those are soaking, it's a good idea to use some micro set on the area to help transfers adhere to it. Then apply the transfers using a brush and slide them into place. Once I've got them positioned, I apply some micro sol. This will help the transfers conform to the irregular shapes of the shoulder pads, especially the weathering we've added. Then I'm going to leave them to fully cure. Done, I'm going to come back with a hobby knife or some tools and then remove the transfer in the area that we've cut into the shoulder pads to add some weathering to those transfers. So the next step, I want to add some extra definition to the armour. I used AK Black Panel Liner, which is a black enamel paint that comes pre-mixed in a bottle with an applicator brush, and this flows really nicely into any recesses. So go around and fill in any recesses with this black, and you could leave the model here if you're happy with this level of weathering, but I want to take it a step further, so I bring out the big gun. Streak and Grime for interiors by AK Interactive. I'm not going to do an all over wash like you might have seen in some other videos, but I'm going to apply this in areas I want to be extra grimy with a brush, focusing especially on the dents and scratches where the dirt might more easily accumulate. And then I'm going to reduce it using some white spirits on a cotton bud to bring it back to the level I want. The reason I'm not doing an all over wash is it will reduce the contrast between the shadows and highlights that I established early on, and I want to maintain those as much as possible. When I was happy with the grime, I actually wanted to add some more black grime in there, so I used AK Black Enamel Wargame Wash and applied this to the Aquila and to the recesses between the plate and trim on the shoulder pads. When all this had dried, I just had the base and the eyes to do. So for the base, I started off with a layer of AK Dark Earth. This is one of my favourite texture paints. It comes in a big tub and it's fairly inexpensive, and it looks really nice, even just if you used it on its own. And I did a good old base dip using their peat husk basing material. With that done, I wanted to add some splashes of dirt and grime onto the lower legs, so I used AK liquid enamel pigment in both Dark Earth and Vietnam Earth, as well as the brown AK Wargame enamel wash. I applied it using a brush, either directly washing it onto the base or onto the lower legs, and I also loaded up a brush and used the airbrush to blow on the brush bristles to splatter it on the model. With the base done, it was just the eyes, and I used 4 paints here, all from P3, Sanguine base to base the eye lenses, then Khador red to paint in a small portion of the lens in the middle towards the front, followed by Heartfire, again in a smaller section within the previous step, and finally some white mixed into the Heartfire for a final repeat of the previous step, along with a tiny dot at the rear of the lens to make it look like it's shining. With the eyes done, it's just a case of painting the base room black and done. What do you think? Does the weathering live up to the weathering in the computer game? And what do you think of the P3 paints? At the time of recording, they're up on Kickstarter now. Will you be picking any of these up? Let me know. Thanks for watching everyone. See you next time. Bye!